Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute. Hello, and welcome to episode 294 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. When we think of important years in the history of the American Revolution, there are many years to choose from. For example, we might think of 1765 and the Stamp Act crisis, or 1773 and the Tea Crisis. We might go with 1775 and the start of what would become the American War for Independence, or 1776, the year the United States declared its independence. Or we might even go with 1783, the year that marked the official end to the War for Independence. Well, award-winning historian Mary Beth Norton has another year in the Revolution's history that she'd like for us to start paying attention to, and that's the year 1774. Mary Beth Norton is the Mary Donlin Alger Professor Emerita at Cornell University, and the author of the book 1774, The Long Year of Revolution. Now, as we converse with Mary Beth reveals why she believes the 18 months between December 1773 and April 1775 were crucial to the development of the American Revolution, the ways the political divide between those who would become loyalists and those who would become revolutionaries increased throughout 1774, and how conservatives, future loyalists, and future revolutionaries thought about different events, such as the Tea Crisis, the Coercive Acts, and the meeting of the First Continental Congress. But first, have you joined the Ben Franklin's World listener community on Facebook yet? The community is a fun place to hang out. It's a place for us to chat, ask questions, and to attend special programs. It's also the place where Holly White and I post information about our forthcoming interviews so that you have a chance to submit questions to our guest historians. The community is free and easy to join. Just visit benfranklinsworld.com/Facebook. That's benfranklinsworld.com/Facebook. Okay, are you ready to investigate the tumultuous and pivotal year of 1774? Let's go meet our guest historian. Our guest is the Mary Donlin Alger Professor Emerita at Cornell University. She's an award-winning historian who has served as the president of the American Historical Association, our featured guest in episode 112, and she's the author of 6 books, including her most recent book, 1774, The Long Year of Revolution. Welcome back to Ben Franklin's World, Mary Beth Norton.
Thank you so much, Liz. I'm delighted to be back.
As we may know from all of our browsing in different bookstores and book websites, there are a lot of books about the American Revolution out in the world. And many of these books tend to focus on dates, like 1775 or 1776, sometimes 1781 or 1783. And Mary Beth, you've chosen to focus your latest history on the year 1774. So would you tell us about 1774 and what prompted you to write a book about it?
It all goes back to work on my dissertation many years ago in the, would you believe, 1960s, when I was working on loyalists. And I realized during the course of working on that book that 1774 was absolutely crucial for the creation of loyalist identity. I might add right now as an aside that I discovered that it's also the year that the term loyalist was coined for the first time. I didn't know that before the time it was used for the first time. In any event, I discovered that 1774 was when people really divided in the American colonies. Before 1774, there were definite resistance movements to Britain. We all know about the resistance to the Stamp Act and the Townsend duties and so forth. But that was not a dividing line between people who wanted to go in totally different directions. But what happened in 1774 was that the population divided between people who wanted to stay a part of the empire and people who decided, maybe we're not so sure we want to be part of the empire. In late 1773, I'd say pretty much every American is a loyal subject of Great Britain and would say so. by the end of 1774, there were a lot of people in the colonies who do not fit that description. So that's why I thought it was absolutely crucial to focus on 1774, because I thought very few people actually had.
It's true. Really, no one has focused on 1774. And it's really interesting to hear that your interest in this year dates back to your earliest work, your dissertation, and what would become your first book, The British Americans, which was a study about American Loyalist exiles who spent the Revolution in England. Could you tell us more about how your very early interest in Loyalists in 1774 informed the research and writing you did for this new book, 1774?
Well, one of the things it did was it meant that I really wanted to give Loyalists, or at least conservatives, some of whom ended up as revolutionaries, equal time. Because most histories of the run-up to the Revolution do not give equal time to the dissenting voices or to the people who disagree with the people who are going to be the leaders of the Revolution. That is, most books about this period, and I go back to the 1760s there, focus, whether they do so explicitly or implicitly, on the viewpoint of the men who are going to be the leaders of the Revolution. They do not pay very much attention to the people who have questions about that strategy, those tactics, and so forth. And I wanted to give every person whose opinion in America I could discern, I could find in print or in letters, I wanted to give every person a voice. I wanted to show Americans today the cacophony of voices in America in 1774 and how many disagreements there were. I thought it was really crucial to do that, because I think Americans today tend to think, the revolution, everybody supported the revolution except for a very few loyalists. That's not true. It may have been ultimately true in the long run, but in 1774, there were lots of disagreements, and I wanted to explore those. I wanted to make clear to people today that American politics in 1774 was not perhaps all that different from American politics in 2020, which is something that I say in the introduction.
Now, in your study of 1774, you actually bring your study of 1774 back to the end of 1773 and the tea crisis. And Alec wonders if you would tell us about the tea crisis and why you think the tea crisis set off such a firestorm among British Americans.
Of course, my book is called The Long Year of Revolution. And what I mean by that is a year that starts with the tea crisis in late 1773 and ends just before the battles at Lexington and Concord. So my year of 1774 is in effect 16 or 17 months. The tea crisis really began when people in North America learned that tea ships were coming, carrying tea directly from the East India Company. So that happened in October of 1773, even though the Tea Act was passed in London in May of 1773. And in short, what the Tea Act did was to give the East India Company the right or the ability to sell tea directly to American consumers without going through middlemen, merchants in London, and a designated tea consignees. So when the tea ships came, there were 7 tea ships, and they arrived in different places. One of them wrecked on Cape Cod, as regular listeners of Ben Franklin's World know, because I talked about it in an earlier episode. When the tea ships arrived, the Americans had to decide what to do about those tea ships, because they objected not so much to the amount of the tea tax as to the symbolism of the tea tax. People today have a complete misconception of what the Boston Tea Party was all about. People think it was because Americans were objecting to higher tea prices or higher taxes. They were actually objecting to the symbolism of the tea tax, and what they were protesting was lower tea taxes, because that's what the Tea Act did. It lowered the taxes that Americans would have to pay on tea in order to compete with smuggled tea, which most people were actually buying and drinking. So when the Bostonians decided to throw the tea overboard, that really set off the crisis. The other colonies found other ways of dealing with the tea ships. Philadelphia and New York would not allow the tea ships to land, and Charleston, where the tea ship was at exactly the same time the ships were in Boston, did something else entirely. The people in Charleston colluded with the local customs officials and simply allowed the tea to be confiscated by the customs officials, who then wrote to London for directions about what to do with the tea. And of course, since everything blew up relatively shortly thereafter, nothing ever happened. with that tea, except years later it was sold for the support of the revolution.
Yes, that was a fun conversation, wasn't it, when we talked at length about the tea crisis of 1773 and the lost Boston tea ship in episode 112. But one aspect that we didn't talk about in episode 112 is the fact that you see Philadelphia and not Boston as the leader of the tea crisis. So I wonder if you could tell us why that is. Why do you see Philadelphia as taking the lead in the tea crisis and not Boston?
Yes, this was one of the surprising things I found in my research. I was really surprised that, in fact, Boston hung back in opposition to the East India Company tea ships. It was in Philadelphia that the first newspaper essays were published opposing the coming of the tea. And there were two different ones. One proposed that Americans should deal with the tea consignees the way they had dealt with the stamp distributors back in 1765, that is, forcing them to resign. And the theory was that if there's no consignees to receive the tea, then there can be no tea sales. The other was by Benjamin Rush, and it said, let's prevent the tea from landing in the first place. These essays were then reprinted elsewhere in the colonies. I might add, they both came out in the middle of October 1773, right after the Americans first learned that the tea ships were coming. And they were reprinted in other colonies. In fact, there was another letter to the editor, in effect, in one of the Boston papers, chiding the leaders of Boston and said, wait a minute, why are we not doing what Philadelphia is doing? And what Philadelphia did was to hold a mass meeting at the State House. It was outside the State House. Apparently, thousands of men attended. At least that's what the newspapers say. And Philadelphia adopted a resolution against the East India Company, against the tea, and so forth. And when Boston finally had its mass meeting, which was several weeks later, what did the Bostonians do? They simply readopted the Philadelphia Statement. It says specifically, our friends in Philadelphia have said exactly what needs to be said, and so we readopt what they said. So that's what I mean. Philadelphia took the lead in charting what should be done in response to the tea ships.
So in this case, it really sounds like Philadelphia and Boston were talking to each other. Was communication between these cities facilitated by newspapers, or was this a conversation that was happening through private letters and committees of correspondence?
In fact, it was newspapers at this point. The committees of correspondence were not particularly active. Most of the committees of correspondence at the time were actually formal committees of correspondence connected to the colonial legislatures. And these were entirely informal contacts, and it was basically done through newspapers, through the newspaper editors picking up from other papers in other places things that they liked and reprinting them in their journals. And so one of the things that I did in the book was to trace, in many ways, the kinds of things that got picked up from one newspaper to another. And one of them, I might add, astonished me. It turned up in something like 8 or 10 different colonial newspapers, and it was basically a tea catechism. It was published in New York first, and I have no idea who wrote it, but it basically had a whole series of questions and answers about how do we deal with the tea and why is the tea such a danger to us, and basically concluded that everyone had a right to oppose the tea because it was like an attack on their individual houses. I thought it was a remarkable piece of logic that if you accepted the arguments that the author was making, it led you inevitably to the idea that you should oppose the arrival of East India Company tea. And that came out then in the fall of 1773.
I'd really like for us to talk about the imperial response to the tea crisis and to Boston's destruction of the tea in December 1773. But first, I wonder about the colonial response. In all of the research you did in newspapers, was there a response from Philadelphia and other colonies to Boston's destruction of the tea in December 1773?
Yes, a lot of newspapers carried stories. For example, the best place to find it actually in the newspapers is in reports of town meetings in New England. And the town meetings in New England are interesting because they do not, in fact, automatically support Boston's destruction of the tea. They do support Boston generally, and they'll just say they support the rights of Americans and so forth. But very few towns in New England, and I read statements from towns in New Hampshire and Rhode Island, as well as in Massachusetts, very few towns say, "Hooray, Boston, you were right to destroy the tea." They do say things like, "Hooray, we have to stand up for American rights and liberties," but they don't say explicitly, "You were right to destroy the tea." And I thought this was very interesting. They're very discreet on the issue of the destruction of private property, in this case, the destruction of the East India Company's tea.
And that's really interesting because what you found in the newspapers really goes against the narrative that we hear every time we talk about the Tea Party, which is everyone pulled together and united behind Boston and its destruction of the tea.
I found that it's really only after the British do respond and Parliament does pass the Boston Port Act, which closes the port of Boston until the tea is paid for and until Boston agrees to submit to British rule, more genteelly, shall we say, or more politely. I found that after that, yes, there are more statements in favor of Boston, but they're still not in favor of the destruction of the tea. And one of my favorite things to cite here is George Washington. George Washington, in his diary and letters that I read, does not say anything about what's going on with tea or anything else until he knows about the Boston Tea Party and the Boston Port Act. Then he says in a famous quote, "The cause of Boston is now the cause of all America." And that's quoted a lot. But what most people leave out is a parenthetical phrase he adds at the end, which is not that we approve of their destruction of the tea. So the passage of the Boston Port Act helped Boston to win support elsewhere, but not to approve their destruction of the tea.
Now, as Mary Beth has noted, there were repercussions for Boston's destruction of the tea in 1773. And those repercussions came in the form of the coercive acts. Mary Beth, would you tell us about the coercive acts and why the colonists also called these acts the intolerable acts?
Yes, well, the first act, of course, is the one I've just mentioned, the Boston Port Act. The other two are more generally aimed at Massachusetts, not specifically at Boston. The Massachusetts Government Act changed the charter of Massachusetts Bay Colony, which went back to 1691, and changed it in ways to make it align with the government of the other colonies, having to do with, say, for example, the naming of members of the council. There were various aspects of the Massachusetts government that governors had long complained about, and the Massachusetts Government Act changed those. The other act that was aimed also at Massachusetts was called the Administration of Justice Act. And in brief, it provided that a colonial official or a British military officer or other soldier who was accused of killing or injuring a colonist who was objecting in a protest against British policy would be tried or possibly be tried in England and not in America. That act, I think, was really the crucial one that turned people off in the colonies. The colonists called it the Murder Act. I was shocked, surprised when I found that because I had never seen that in any of the published literature about the Administration of Justice Act. But even people who later became loyalists objected strongly to the Murder Act because they said it meant that British authorities could run roughshod over the American population. The Massachusetts Government Act made more people who were colonial officials, that is, people who were elected legislators and so forth, made them angry because it made them think if Parliament can change the charter of Massachusetts the way they've done, could they change our charter also? But the Massachusetts Government Act actually found supporters in the colonies. There were people who said, well, yes, all it does is turn the charter of Massachusetts into looking like the charter of our colony that already exists. This is something that was said in Georgia, for example. And so why should we be worried about it? So, in fact, I think it's the Administration of Justice Act and the idea of the Murder Act that really turned a lot of people off and made people very angry with what Parliament was doing.
The colonists really had a way with political propaganda, didn't they? I mean, they were calling the coercive acts the intolerable acts, and now the, quote, Murder Act. I mean, that wasn't the name Parliament gave its Administration of Justice Act.
It certainly was not. Yes, they did have a way with words, shall we say. Yes.
Was this the case in all the pamphlets that you looked at, that the colonists had a way with words?
Well, a lot of them were pretty turgid, shall we say. They go into great detail about topics that I think maybe people other than the authors of the pamphlets were not necessarily so interested in. I think in many ways, the newspapers were shorter and crisper in the kinds of things that they said. For one thing, the essays were a lot shorter than they were in the pamphlets. In a pamphlet, somebody could rattle on. And I discovered there were pamphleteers who rattled on, including Alexander Hamilton. He went on and on. He didn't know how to stop.
Now, as you mentioned earlier, the British colonists living in the 13 colonies between New Hampshire and Georgia did develop different responses to the coercive acts of 1774. Could you tell us more about these different colonial responses to the coercive acts?
Yes, the different colonies developed different responses. Basically, in New England, there were town meetings. I've already talked about those, and they adopted town statements on things. That did not happen in Virginia, where there was no tradition of town meetings. There were barely towns, as we all know. So basically, in Virginia, there were county meetings, and the county meetings over the summer of 1774 developed their own statements in response to the coercive acts. I thought it was fascinating that of the 28 county statements in Virginia that I was able to unearth, 27 were completely unique. That is, although they said pretty much the same things, they said them in different ways. And so I concluded that they represented a local consensus. They started off in different ways. Some of them went into the history of Virginia. Some of them didn't. Some of them proclaimed their loyalty to the king first, that sort of thing. But basically, only one county explicitly copied all the words of another county. So I argue in the book that these represent real, shall we say, local thinking about the issues. And I was able to find in correspondence letters from people who had disagreed in these meetings with what was going on. So I do have a little bit of evidence about the kinds of debates that occurred in these meetings, but it's very rare. I wish I had more. Of course, there's no transcripts of any of these meetings and so forth. All we have are the resolutions that were adopted afterwards. And the same is true of the more colony-wide meetings that occurred in South Carolina. And in Georgia, there was a small meeting that some people then said, oh, but we tried to get into the meeting, but they barred the door against us, so we couldn't get in. So this meeting does not absolutely represent what we think.
Did the local responses you found reveal any information about how the colonists came up with one of their big methods to respond to the coercive acts, which was the Non-Importation Pact? Could you tell us about the Non-Importation, Non-Exportation Pact?
Well, the idea was to place economic pressure on the parliament. Obviously, Americans did not have representatives in parliament. So the idea behind all of this was we all buy all this stuff from England, and that's something we all know about now because of the work that's been done on the commerce between England and America in the period immediately preceding the Revolution. The idea was what we do is by stopping buying British goods, we will put pressure on our friends, the merchants. Our friends, the merchants, will have impact on Parliament, and they will then persuade their members of Parliament and other members of Parliament to repeal these acts that we don't like because their economy is being destroyed. And the same argument was there about non-exportation. The argument was they are relying, especially the British West Indies, are relying on our timber, our salt fish, and so forth. And if we do non-exportation to the British West Indies, then this too will cause the planters in the British West Indies to pressure their friends in Parliament, and that will lead Parliament to succumb to what we want.
And did any of the local responses you found in newspapers or pamphlets or in these town and county meetings, did you find anything that revealed any information about how the colonists came up with the idea to protest via non-importation and non-exportation?
Well, a lot of people supported it from the beginning. I think it was in the air, as we might say, because, of course, a non-importation pact had been used in response to the Townshend duties in the late 1760s, and people thought that had worked. For a whole variety of reasons today, historians think it didn't, but the Townshend duties were largely repealed, and so people did think it had worked. So from the very beginning, a non-importation pact was part of the plan, or part of the ideas that were proposed. For example, Boston, initially the Bostonians proposed from the very beginning in response to the Boston Port Act, the Boston Committee of Correspondence sent out word to other colonies saying, let's do non-importation immediately, and let's do non-exportation too. And so that was a tactic that was thought of the entire time. It was not a new tactic. The thing that was different was the addition of non-exportation. People really disagreed about non-exportation, I discovered. That was where the big disagreements came in the Virginia meetings. What would we agree not to export? What would we agree not to import? There were many disagreements about specifics, even if they agreed generally to non-importation. And non-exportation had many fewer adherents in the local meetings than non-importation did.
Now, another big colonial response to the coercive acts was the decision to call the First Continental Congress to meet. Mary Beth, I'd like for us to talk about the First Continental Congress and who called for this Congress to come together. But first, I'd like for us to talk about a new podcast. You may have learned that the Emancipation Proclamation and Civil War Union victories ended slavery in the United States. But so much more went into abolishing slavery than battles and declarations. And freedom meant more to Black people than eventually being paid for their labor. Seizing Freedom is a new podcast from Virginia Public Media, or VPM, which focuses on the agency Black people exercised to define what freedom meant for themselves. In Seizing Freedom, you'll hear how Black Americans fought to liberate themselves during the Civil War, and how they made freedom real by organizing for equality and justice during Reconstruction, despite every attempt to violently suppress their actions. You'll also hear how Black Americans went about accomplishing these feats in their own words. Seizing Freedom presents these stories through the lens of lived experience, drawing from letters, diary entries, autobiographies, and more, to showcase voices from United States history that have long been ignored. You can find the Seizing Freedom podcast at seizingfreedom.com, and you can subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. Mary Beth, where did the colonists get the idea to call for a Continental Congress, and why did the colonists want this Congress to meet in Philadelphia?
It's very interesting because this is, again, something that's not widely known. The idea of a Continental Congress was actually a conservative idea. It was the response to Boston's call for immediate non-importation in response to the Boston Port Act. But very quickly, people in Connecticut in particular, and Philadelphia and New York, all said, no, we don't want to do this until we've had a chance to talk. All the colonies need to get together to discuss a tactic, not immediately jumping in to support Boston in this call. And in fact, I discovered that the only colony where there were meetings, in this case, meetings in Baltimore and Annapolis, that robustly supported the Bostonians was Maryland. All the other colonies, when they had a chance to weigh in, said, wait a minute, let's all get together and talk about it. Now, why Philadelphia? Well, it was centrally located, and Philadelphians were among the people who called for the Continental Congress.
Now, I imagine from the earlier part of our conversation that news of the call for the First Continental Congress likely filtered out through local newspapers, and perhaps there were even some pamphlets about it, wordy pamphlets about it. So I imagine this is a public call. So how did Crown officials in these colonies respond to ideas of non-importation, non-exportation, and let's get a Continental Congress together so we can talk about these measures?
The Crown officials were obviously very unhappy about the idea of the Continental Congress. They knew that if non-importation, non-exportation was to be successful, it would have to be decided through a general meeting. So they wanted to prevent the general meeting from taking place. So a number of governors, when the legislatures were supposed to meet, instead abrogated them. And so they postponed them, or they dissolved the legislatures, calling for new elections so that those meetings could not occur. And they thought, well, the colonial legislatures will then elect people to go to the Continental Congress. It turned out not to be a good tactic because in numerous cases, the colonial legislators simply adjourned as a legislature and went to another room, went to a tavern. This happened in Virginia famously, and named people to a Continental Congress anyway. So the tactic that the governors used, really backed up by the British in London, the tactic they used, which they originally thought, well, this is going to stop everything because the Americans are not going to be able to elect people, didn't work at all. And in fact, put the elections out of the control of the governors. And the governors, I read all the correspondence, I might add, from the governors to London, and they were extremely frustrated because they could do nothing with these groups that were meeting, were eventually they called themselves conventions and congresses. They could not control it because these were not official bodies.
Do you think the royal governor's inability to stop the colonists from voting for delegates to the First Continental Congress is also why the governor of Pennsylvania doesn't seem to have done anything to prevent the Congress from meeting in his capital city?
The governor of Pennsylvania at the time was a really weak reed. In fact, he was reamed out by Dartmouth for the fact that he did nothing while the tea crisis hit Philadelphia. I mean, he was a representative of the proprietor's family of the Penns, and he was like a cousin or something. He was actually the deputy governor, and he did nothing. I mean, literally. And everybody commented on how useless he was. So I think he was a kind of a non-entity who did not do anything. But of course, even the governors who tried to do something couldn't accomplish anything. They literally could not stop what was happening. And that's, to me, another interesting thing. It was like the congresses and the conventions that were eventually held in all of the states, then colonies, to elect delegates to the Continental Congress could not be controlled by the governors. Now, I might add, it's very ironic that one of the few colonial assemblies that officially elected delegates to the Continental Congress was Massachusetts. And this was in the context of the military governorship of General Gage. The Massachusetts Assembly put out a false statement that they were working on something conciliatory. They locked their door, and they then proceeded to not only elect delegates to the Continental Congress, they proceeded to give money to those people to support their trip to Philadelphia. So the governor, when he found this out, when the news leaked out that it was happening, he sent the secretary of the colony to dissolve the assembly, and they wouldn't let him in. So the secretary of the colony stood outside the door, in effect yelling at the assembly that they were dissolved, but it was too late. The assembly had already elected the delegates to the Continental Congress, including John and Samuel Adams and others, and had, in fact, appropriated money to pay their way. It was a major coup on the part of the Massachusetts people. So that was one of the few colonies that actually officially elected delegates to the Congress.
Now, the First Continental Congress convened in September 1774. Mary Beth, in what ways do you think this Congress may have helped or hindered the revolutionaries with their revolutionary efforts?
Well, actually, you know what? I would amend your question, Liz. I wouldn't say revolutionaries because I think that's a little early to call them revolutionaries. You might say the radicals who wanted more open resistance to Britain. I think one of the things that it did remarkably was it introduced people from all over the colonies who were the political leaders who might not have been particularly radical to each other. And one of the things we can see is that in the wake of the Continental Congress, we begin to see delegates from different colonies writing to each other. These are people who never knew each other before. The Continental Congress really created a group of men who, if not totally like-minded, knew each other, knew each other's opinions, and that worked very much to assist, shall we say, the growing consensus in North America about resistance.
And did the First Continental Congress come to any resolve on the ideas of non-importation and non-exportation?
Indeed, that's what's in the Continental Association. The document of the Continental Association, which is adopted late in the congressional meeting, and indeed, alas, at a time when hardly anyone was taking notes on the debates, so we don't really know. There were no official minutes kept, and nobody outside was allowed in, and the congressmen were not supposed to talk about it. So all I was able to glean about the debates generally were occasional reports and other people's correspondence or surviving notes that have been, in fact, preserved in the letters of the members of the Congress, the wonderful edition prepared by Paul Smith and another team of people years ago. But in any event, even though we don't know what happened or what the contents of the debate were, what we do know is that by the end of the Congress, they had agreed on non-importation and they had agreed on non-exportation that would go into effect a year later, or not quite a year later, would go into effect later if the British did not respond well to their overtures, what they regarded as overtures, which the British did not regard as overtures, for conciliation.
Would you tell us what the Continental Association was?
The Continental Association was an agreement of all the colonies not to import British goods and also eventually not to export either. And it also carried coercive measures. Very significantly, it asked every county, city, and town in America to establish local committees to enforce the Continental Association. And I regard this as really crucial. In some cases, it was the first local committees with locally elected people set up to, in effect, govern the colonies. It started off as strictly an economic thing. That is, the local committees empowered themselves, in effect, to enforce non-importation when a ship would arrive from anywhere, from Britain, from the British West Indies. The committee would go on board and after the deadlines had passed, then tell the ship it had to turn around and leave or throw the stuff overboard. There were times when whole cargoes of one sort or another were thrown overboard because it was after the deadline for non-importation to begin, even when the ships had left the port they had left before the ships could have learned about non-importation. So the local committees tended to be very precise in their enforcement. And I discovered that even Thomas Jefferson ran afoul of this. He had some items for his house coming from England, and those items were basically stopped because they arrived after the non-importation went into effect.
I'd like for us to go back to something you said earlier in our conversation, which is that your goal in 1774 was to give equal weight to conservative or what would become loyalist voices with those who were more radical, those who become revolutionaries. So to this end, would you tell us about King George III's responses to what is going on in his 13 British North American colonies in 1774?
It actually starts in October of 1774 when George III was informed by his ministers that American colonists were in Europe and England looking for arms and ammunition. And some of the more interesting sources I found were correspondence in the Foreign Office records in London with the ambassador to The Hague commenting that there had been ships in Amsterdam who were taking on board cargoes of cannon and muskets and ammunition, gunpowder. And he wrote to the ministry to tell them this was happening. The ministry immediately wrote to the Navy to say, send Coast Guard cutters there to see what you can do to stop these ships, these American ships, from getting these armaments. And this obviously made its way to George III. And so on the 19th of October in 1774, he issued an order in council forbidding the export of arms and ammunition from Britain to the colonies for 6 months. He later on extended that. But in any event, he could not order the stop of the export of arms and ammunition from the Netherlands, of course, but he could order it from Britain. So what happened was the news of that October the 19th order from the king arrived in Rhode Island on the 8th of December. And it was accompanied by an order from Lord Dartmouth telling governors to confiscate any arms and ammunition that arrived in the colonies. Well, this set off a firestorm in the colonies with crowds in Newport, Rhode Island, New London, Connecticut, and Portsmouth, New Hampshire, all attacking local forts and confiscating the arms and ammunition that they found in those local forts and carrying them off and secreting them in the countryside. So it's interesting that it's an order in October, but arriving in December that really begins a lot of the, shall we say, public activity that looks toward war. And I regard this as a really crucial moment in the coming of the revolution. These attacks on the forts in New England in early December of 1774, which are all a response to the king's order in council of October. Then another thing that happened in January, but it's again because of when the news arrives. On the 30th of November, the king gave a speech to Parliament at the opening of a new Parliament. The Parliament had been dissolved. There were parliamentary elections in the summer of 1774, and Americans were hoping that the new Parliament would be more sympathetic to their claims. And the king, however, in his speech to the new parliament on the 30th of November basically declared the colonies in rebellion, and didn't quite put in those terms, but came very close to it. And when the news of that arrived in January, a number of Americans, including Abigail Adams, wrote and said, the die is cast.
So tensions were really heating up between Great Britain and her colonies in late 1774, early 1775. I mean, you have the rebellious colonists who were concerned about the imperial response. And I have to believe that the conservatives, those who would become loyalists, would also have been concerned about the imperial response. In fact, Mary Beth, could you tell us more about how the loyalists experienced everything that was going on in 1774?
Sure. I would say conservatives rather than loyalists at first. The conservative forces in 1774 did their best to hold back what they saw happening. But they also originally pinned their hopes on the Continental Congress. Remember, the Continental Congress was the proposal of the more conservative and moderate colonists, not the people who wanted to jump into resistance to Britain at the call of the Boston Committee. I discovered several loyalist pamphlets that were published by future loyalists, published just before the meeting of the First Continental Congress, and they actually were quite hopeful about the Continental Congress being a conciliatory body that would help to lead to reconciliation. So, for example, Thomas Bradbury Chandler of New Jersey, who's a very important loyalist pamphleteer, writes a pamphlet, publishes a pamphlet just before the meeting of the Congress. And at the end of it, he tells his readers, listen to the members of the Continental Congress. They are your selected leaders. They may have been elected irregularly, but nevertheless, they've been selected. They're your official leaders, and you should defer to their opinions. So he's expecting the men who are elected to the Continental Congress to be more moderates and to lead to conciliation with Britain. It's not until the Congress goes forward in September and October and word begins to leak out about what the Congress is doing. And in particular, when in the middle of September, the Congress forecasts that it's going to promote non-importation, that the future loyalists lose heart. And in fact, one of them stops a pamphlet that he was writing, and he basically stops and he says, I'm not going to write anymore because it's useless. Chandler did not stop. Chandler wrote another pamphlet, a very important pamphlet called What Think Ye of the Congress Now, in which he basically publishes just before the Congress adjourns, but when he writes about what he thinks about how the Congress is going off the rails and is doing things that it shouldn't be doing.
Could we talk about language and word use for a moment? Because we can tell that you've done a lot of research about when we can appropriately call someone a loyalist or a revolutionary. And this is a topic of big debate among scholars of the Revolution. So would you tell us more about your views on these terms, loyalist and revolutionary, and when you think we can safely use them to talk about, the politics of the American Revolution?
Well, I don't think you can have people who call themselves loyalists, and that's what happened. That's when the term emerges. It's in a letter of Jonathan Sewell, who, as we know, is a very close friend of John Adams. He's the first person who, he says something like myself and my fellow loyalists. And this is the very end of 1774. And when I saw that, I thought that's really interesting, because what it means is that he's now perceiving other people as being openly disloyal. You don't have people who call themselves loyalists until you have disloyal people, openly disloyal people. And then other people in 1775 began to use the word loyalist. So I thought that was a fascinating point. One of the other fascinating points I discovered is the use of the term unconstitutional, which is introduced into the American lexicon in the course of the discourse of 1774. It turns out that everybody called what everybody else was doing unconstitutional. It becomes a kind of a bat to beat the other side with. The conservatives and the governors said that what the Americans were doing was unconstitutional because they had established these committees and congresses that had no basis in the regular government. The Americans, the people who supported resistance, said that what the British were doing was unconstitutional because they were operating outside the regular boundaries of expected government action by these coercive acts and by the changes that Parliament was making in the American charters, which they thought they should not be able to make. So both sides use this term unconstitutional. When I realized that it was popping up in things, I actually did several keyword searches on America's historic newspapers and discovered that before the 1750s, the only time the word unconstitutional appeared in American newspapers was when it was reprinted from British sources. It started to appear in American newspapers, although not real commonly in the 1760s debates over the Stamp Act. But when it really appears all the time is in the newspapers in 1774. And what clued me into looking for the word unconstitutional was I discovered an essay in 1773 by somebody that said basically, will somebody please explain the word unconstitutional to me because I've never seen it before. And that showed me that it was a new locution as far as the Americans were concerned. But it became the standard argument that people on both sides used to beat up the other side.
Mary Beth, you're someone who has spent a career studying early American history and the American Revolution. And I wonder, as you consider all of the research you've done over the years, whether you think 1774 is really on par with other big years in the United States' revolutionary history. Is 1774 on par with, say, 1776?
Oh, I think 1774 is, in fact, extremely important. In fact, I would argue that by the time the battles at Lexington and Concord occur in April of 1775, even though Americans haven't officially voted for independence, and even in Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Congress is leery about what it's doing, Americans have voted with their feet, in effect. They are leaving the empire. And what tells me this? It's that the governors write consistently to England from late 1774 on through well into 1775. I cannot get these people to obey me. They will not pay attention to what I do. They are calling the resolutions of the Continental Congress their laws. They are obeying those and not the decrees of Parliament or the ministry. They are going their own way. And it's uniform. The governors write to Lord Dartmouth and they say, I'm not even going to try to enforce what you want me to do because it would only highlight the impotence of my government and my helplessness in the face of this colonial consensus. So in a lot of ways, I think that 1774 is the crucial year, and the battles that come later and the amount of time that it takes to adopt the Declaration of Independence are simply putting a period to a decision that's already been made. And I will add here that one of the epigrams that I use in the book that it just jumped out at me when I found it. It's from an essay in Philadelphia that's published in November of 1774. And the author says, I wish I could be alive to see the Jubilee of 1874. Now, I think for any historian of the Revolution, that has to carry echoes of the centennial celebration in 1876 in Philadelphia. And frankly, that essay I have discovered has been cited by a number of other authors who've written about this period, and nobody has highlighted that sentence. And I just thought that sentence tells me everything I need to know about where Americans are going in late 1774.
Now it's time for us to jump into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently, or if someone had acted differently. In your opinion, Mary Beth, what might have happened if Boston had not destroyed the tea in December 1773? What would 1774 have been like if there had been no coercive acts and therefore no punishment for the destruction of the tea?
That's a really good question, Liz. It's something to think about. As I think about it, What would be the alternative to Boston destroying the tea? The most obvious alternative would have been the same thing that happened in Charleston. If the Bostonians had been willing to collude with the customs officers in having the tea seized and stored by the customs officers, then we would have had the same thing happening in Boston that happened in Charleston. I might add that the British were not happy about what happened in Charleston, but because of what happened in Boston, they didn't pay that much attention to it later on. So if we play this scenario out, the customs officers, the colonial officials would have written back to London and said, we were not able to do anything with the tea. 2 tea ships were turned away in Philadelphia and New York, and the tea was confiscated by us, by the customs officers in Boston and Charleston. Then what? Well, I rather think that what might have happened was what John Adams thought was going to happen even after the destruction of the tea. He said in early 1774, before he knew about the Boston Port Act, he said he thought there would be like a pendulum going back and forth between England and America, with many letters, many discussions, and people trying to decide what to do. But I do think that ultimately the British would have told the customs officials in Boston and Charleston, try to sell the tea. And that might have, in fact, set off the storm. Maybe not as much as the destruction of the tea did, but it could still have led to revolution ultimately.
Now, you've written 6 books on the American Revolution and early American history. Do you have a 7th book planned?
Actually, when I'm between major books, I tend to write sort of short things. I tend to adopt short projects, and I have a couple of short projects in mind. But frankly, I've given myself a few months off, so I've not been doing anything lately. But I will say that those projects include circling back in some ways to a theme that I talked about in Liberty's Daughters, which is the role of women in resistance to the British in the 1760s. I now, because of my work in the book Separated by Their Sex, I now understand much better than I did when I wrote Liberty's Daughters, which was published first. I now know considerably more about the culture that the women who were involved in the political activity in the 1760s, what their background was. And I'd like to circle back to that material, which I didn't fully investigate for Liberty's Daughters, and write an article, which in fact carries on some of the themes that I developed in my presidential address to the AHA in January of 2019. So that's one project. It would be an article length kind of thing. The other is actually an editing project of the letters of a very interesting loyalist woman that I first encountered when I did my dissertation and have circled back to again. They're very interesting letters, and I have a PDF of the texts, and I may, in fact, edit them for publication. There's about 50 or 60 pages of very interesting letters from Massachusetts in the 1760s.
What's the best way to contact you if we have more questions about the happenings in 1774?
You can find me on my webpage through the Cornell University website. I'm listed as an emeritus faculty member.
Mary Beth Norton, thank you so much for taking us through the tumultuous and long year of 1774.
Thank you, Liz. It's been very interesting going through it with you.
Is 1774 an important year in the history of the American Revolution? As Mary Beth revealed, it's in the long year of 1774, that time between the tea crisis of 1773 and the battles at Lexington and Concord in 1775, that we can see how many British Americans made their way to a decision to either continue their support for the British Empire or to leave it. These political decisions formed largely during the tumultuous 18 months of the long 1774. By focusing on early 1774, we can see how the tea crisis and Boston's destruction of the tea caused many people to take to town and county meetings, newspapers, and pamphlets to share their ideas about how the British American colonies should respond to the symbolism of the tea tax. A tax that did reduce the cost of tea, but was still a tax which Parliament imposed on the colonies without the colonists' consent. We can also see in the political events of 1774 how the structures that would come to organize and lead the American Revolutionary Movement, such as the Continental Congress, were formed out of conservative, rather than revolutionary ideas about how to make sure the colonies acted as one, or at least coordinated their actions together, against the empire and its consolidation of power in North America. So was 1774 an important year in the history of the American Revolution? Well, it seems if we want to understand how Americans understood the revolutionary movement as it took place, then looking at newspapers, private correspondence, pamphlets, and local government minutes from 1774 will give us a really great idea of how Americans understood the events around them and how their thoughts about the imperial crisis and the American Revolution evolved. Look for more information about Mary Beth, her book, 1774, plus notes and links for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/294. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. So if you enjoyed Ben Franklin's World, please tell your friends and family about it. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's digital audio team. Joseph Edelman, Martha Howard, Holly White, Karen Wolf, and Peyton Young. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. Finally, are you convinced? Do you think 1774 is a year that deserves more attention in our study of the American Revolution? Let me know what you think. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.